I think it's Steve Jobs who says there's sophistication, or said there's sophistication in simplicity, and we decided to do it that way. We're Compound Everything, and we talk money, markets, investing. And today we are continuing on our discussion about how to value a company that is non-profitable or has negative earnings. And before we start, if you can like and subscribe our video, that would be really helpful to us.
Yeah. So we're continuing our discussion today on BFLY Network.
Yes.
Which is...
You want to just recap what BFLY is?
So BFLY Network is a company at this point that distributes and sells a point-of-care ultrasound probe, but the indications for ultrasound are only getting wider and more entrenched in medicine as time goes on, and in veterinary medicine as well. Right.
So we're not going to go into too much depth about BFLY, because if you go back to our last video before
you can get it all there,
we spend a good 12 minutes talking about
what it is and
whatnot. But essentially it's just a small little ultrasound that runs on chip technology.
To cut to the chase, they've managed to scale down ultrasound technology into a small probe that is much more affordable and easier to use for the routine professional medical practitioners.
So the main thing is it's cheaper.
Yes.
So that is what partly makes you bullish, because being cheaper, that is what is going to make the total addressable market bigger, which is what we're going to get to when we were valuing this company.
So how did we value a non-profitable company that has very few comparables and has no track record, really?
Right. And if you want to know why we picked this particular company, again, you can go back.
Yeah.
You can go back to our previous video, because we really get into depth about BFLY there.
So that's the challenge. We're going to stick our neck out a little bit on this one, and actually give our thoughts of what the value actually is per share of the BFLY Network.
Of the company. So what are the difficulties of, there are different types of negative companies with negative earnings, or there's different reasons why they have negative earnings. So this one is possibly the hardest type of company to value with negative earnings.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the ones that I find most difficult, because it's never been profitable.
Yeah, and there's no history.
And there's no clear path to when it's going to be profitable. So, in the next few quarters, if you could assume they're going to be profitable at that time, then you could maybe start to scale up and whatnot. But it becomes a little like calling who's going to win a horse race at the beginning, right? Versus 2/3 the way through or 3/4 the way through, you can probably pick a horse that's probably going to win.
Right, which is why we generally don't pick companies with negative earnings.
Yeah.
And we particularly don't pick companies with negative earnings when it's not a one-off.
Now, the interesting thing about this company is that it's a newer company in an older market.
Right.
So the market is already there. The market for ultrasound is already there.
Yeah. So there are different types of companies, or there are different reasons why companies go negative. So it could be a one-off year for whatever reason.
Yeah.
They could have negative earnings because they're cyclical. And so you know that they're going to swing back up and be profitable. And those companies are a little easier because you can just normalize the earnings, having the ability to look back at the history. But the issue with BFLY, and what it made this such a difficult task for us, is that it isn't a one-off. It's just a new company.
Yeah.
And so it's always been unprofitable.
Right.
We don't have any history, and there's really not a lot of comparables.
Not a lot. But we found a few.
And so why don't you go through
how we did it?
How we analyzed a company that is negative earnings with very loose comparables and zero history.
The theory or the thesis that we kind of came up with was, let's take the most what we think are going to be accurate numbers and start from there. And the most accurate...
We're already guessing.
So but I think they're the most accurate numbers we've come up with. What the most accurate number we can come up with was, what's the total addressable market for ultrasound technology right now?
Right.
So as of 2022, the total addressable market for ultrasound technology worldwide is about $8 billion. Yeah. Okay. And there's probably 4 or 5 main players there. There's Philips, there's GE, there's Sonosite. I'm missing one. That doesn't matter. So, but be that as it may, and these main competitors will take up anywhere between some of the larger ones take up to 30% market
share.
share.
I think GE takes like 30%.
Yeah, and then Philips is around 20%, and there's a few other stragglers in there as well.
And one of the reasons we know the numbers for these other companies is that we wanted to look at that, because as we were going through the information on BFLY, one of the questions we had was, is ultrasound one of those industries where most of the market is only spread out between a few main players?
Yeah.
Because there are some things like eating out at a restaurant, for instance.
Right.
There's not only 2 or 3 main restaurants that 30 to 40% of the population go to. It's spread out among many. So we wanted to see, are there many ultrasound companies that are out there, and it's just spread thin, and we can't even really properly give BFLY a huge percentage of the market, because that's not what happens in this industry. But
in fact, I think you can.
We found that it does happen in this industry.
So there is some industry concentration there. There's very few players. And so BFLY is going to be a new player there. So
I didn't look into this. Do you know what BFLY has right now with their percentages in the ultrasound?
Right now it would be, their revenues as of their projected revenues for 2022, I think they're going to be in the realm of like 88 million.
So it's very tiny.
So a very small percentage of the actual market. So we're talking 0.1%.
Right. So if this technology is really revolutionary, which we believe it is, they have a lot of runway to grab market share from these other competitors.
Yes. And so we wanted to start from there. So what are the most reliable numbers that we could start with in something we're just completely guessing on from the beginning, right?
Guess, hope.
Guess, hope. So we decided to take total addressable markets. We know the total addressable market right now of ultrasound is around 8 billion, and it's forecasted by 2030 to be around 12.5 billion. And you can argue back and forth whether that will be the case, but the estimates are that the total addressable market will increase by about between 4.5 and 7.5% annually.
And these numbers are pretty much agreed upon among the ultrasound industry.
From what I've seen. From what we've seen in a fairly loose search. But multiple sources seem to say the same thing. So so we decided, okay, let's start at 12.5 billion as being the total addressable market in 2030. That's
which I feel like that number is pretty accurate. That wasn't really a guess number. That number's pretty...
I think that's pretty reasonable.
Some good research, some good understanding of the
industry and whatnot.
Where the ball's going with ultrasound.
If anything, maybe it'll be a little conservative, but who knows?
But we'll be conservative.
We'll be conservative.
You always want to be more conservative because it gives what Ben Graham would call a margin of safety.
Right, exactly. So we're going to try and give ourselves a margin of safety as we go through this exercise. So our assumption is that by 2030 that the total addressable market for ultrasound will be $12.5 billion. And that's what we're shooting for. And so at that point we said, okay, well, if we have a total addressable market of 12.5 billion, how much market share can BFLY take? And so we thought, oh my, what is the current market share? And that's where we discussed before, GE is somewhere around 30% and Philips has around 20%, and then there's some other stragglers. We thought, well, with something like BFLY, who's got pretty serious technology, maybe they could grab 10% of the market share. Because it's different. It's not a true cart-based ultrasound. So you're still not replacing those folks necessarily because, those have other uses.
Right.
So that's still going to stay. But these market entrants might take some of the market share at current, or at least expand some. So I think from that basis, 10% would be reasonable.
Well, I think 10% is low. It is, to circle back to what you were saying, it is quite revolutionary technology because some of the other ultrasound companies are getting nervous.
Yes,
to the point of
they're getting sued. BFLY is getting sued right now by another one.
By another ultrasound company. And so they obviously have tech that is worrisome.
Yes.
And they obviously have patents and secrets, which is a type of moat.
Yeah.
Which is worrisome to the other players in the industry. Yeah. So when we say 10%, if their technology is as revolutionary as they say,
and as I think it is.
And as you think it is. And if it's able to take market share because it's an easier product to carry around, it's ridiculously cheap in comparison.
And easy to use. And also med students, nursing students, veterinary students are now being trained on its use.
Yeah.
You may actually not be referring for as many formal ultrasounds if you can do it yourself.
Right. Yes, we think that taking 10% of that market share is
$12.5 billion
is a conservative number, but we wanted to be conservative because we didn't want to overstretch it and say, oh, they're going to, become like GE and have the biggest share in the market, because that just might not be the case.
Right, it might not be the case.
But it is a definite possibility that something like BFLY, which is so accessible to physicians and vets and whatnot, would take 10% of that industry.
They're also trying to build a platform that's much easier to use for the average practitioner.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that also has a bit of a moat. So, anyway, we'll stop talking about that.
And also, this is important in the evaluation. They're also taking their system to poorer countries,
right?
Which is amazing for them.
Yes.
Right, and amazing for those physicians, and amazing for those countries, because now they have access to imaging that maybe they didn't have.
Yes.
As much access, because it was so expensive to buy a $50,000.
Well, and to your point, that may actually help expand the TAM.
Right.
Because now, you're going to some poorer country, they can't afford, a $100,000 formal ultrasound machine, $150,000 formal ultrasound machine, but they can afford a $3,000 one.
Yeah, and their CEO mentioned that a few times. I was quite excited in their last earnings call that they're going to these other countries.
Yeah,
so.
and that, again, that's our own personal love of the company, in a sense. Is that's partly what they're doing. So anyway, let's get to the numbers. So if you look at them taking about 10% of the market share, that would give them a revenue at that point in time of 1.25 billion. Okay, so we thought, okay, 1.25 billion revenue out of a total addressable market of 12.5 billion
in 8 years.
In 8 years. So at that point, that's their top line. We're going to guesstimate. And then so you may go, well, what about R&D and all that kind of stuff? Well, I kind of threw a little bit of that to the wayside and just came up with net margin numbers and stole net margin numbers from other companies.
Yeah, okay.
Now, having said that, R&D is an important part, because right now it takes up well over 100% of their revenue. So that's not anything to sneeze at. But over time, what I've noticed in having pulled a few companies is that the R&D for some of these companies, so for GE.
So what were your comparables?
So GE.
The ultrasound area of GE.
Yeah, so the ultrasound area of GE. It was very hard to find, actually. I had to kind of go through their quarterly and annual reports and try to pull it out. And even then, the information is not complete. They don't break it down by ultrasound. Now, GE is also involved in MRI and CT and all these other things that may have different margins than ultrasound, so I'm not sure.
Yeah. So it's a loose comparable.
It's a loose comparable. Fujifilm is another one, and they make, they're the owners of Sonosite. And so again, same thing, they make other equipment. So it was difficult to kind of pull that number out. And they have net margins of 10%.
Okay, so what did GE have? GE had net margins
between 14 and 17%. Okay, depending on the year. And Sonosite had around, or Fujifilm had around 10. Yeah. And then I took another comparable, and this may be a bit of pie in the sky, but it's Intuitive Surgical. Right. Intuitive Surgical does not do ultrasound. They do robotic surgical instruments. Yeah. So different, but still in the medical technology realm. Yeah. And they had net margins of 30%. Okay. But if you look at the spending on R&D from all these companies, right. It tends to be a certain percentage of their revenue going forward. So I think over time, BFLY will probably fall into line in terms of their R&D spending.
Somewhere in that
somewhere in the realm.
The high, what was Intuitive?
So Intuitive had R&D expenses as a percentage of revenue of around between 8% and 12%. Okay. So they've been steadily climbing a little bit upwards as time has gone on. So they back in kind of the mid 2010s, they were around 8%, and more recently 12%. And then GE over the past 3 years has been 5%.
Yeah, it's just constant.
So it's 5%, 5%.
So it's like they budget.
Yeah.
And that's what they give R&D.
Yeah. And I actually couldn't really find Fujifilm, so they I don't know what theirs is. I'm going to assume it falls somewhere into line there. And so I was going to take Intuitive as being kind of a high, and then GE as being a little bit low. And so if you look at their net margins, so their net margins after all expenses, this is where their net earnings are divided by the revenue, right? So their net earnings for Fujifilm was about 10%. Okay. So on the low end. Yeah. And you get GE being around 15%. Okay. Kind of in the middle. Yeah. And then on the high end, you get Intuitive being about 30%. Right. Net margins. So after all said and done, net earnings 30%. Right. So we took those numbers and we said, okay, well, what if BFLY's, takes 10% of this $12.5 billion market. Yeah,
which we thought was conservative.
Right, which we thought was conservative. Yeah. And they only did, call it 10% net margins.
Which we also thought was conservative.
Let's say they're like Fujifilm. Yeah. At that point, we got a valuation per share of about $4.11. Yeah. if you give it a 15% return.
Right.
If that's what you're looking for, is a 15% return. If you go around GE and you say, okay, well, they'll do a little better, and they're about 15%, we got $6.15 as being a fair value for the shares.
Yeah, being less conservative.
Being less conservative, that they're going to get 15% net margins, and they're going to take 10% market share. And if they're more like Intuitive Surgical and their margins are huge and they're 30% net margins, then they will be worth presently at $12.30 per share.
Right. So, and today they close somewhere in the $5-ish range, I think.
Yeah. Now, do your own due diligence. Run your own numbers. Don't simply take our numbers as investing advice at all. But these are numbers that we thought for ourselves looked reasonable.
It was so interesting to do this because Ashwath Damodaran says you have to take the story and you have to turn the story into numbers. Yeah, that's what we've tried to do here. Right, and that's his big thing. And like I said, the reason we did BFLY, I said in the first video, is because you love the company. You love the product, you love what it's doing for medicine, you love it as a physician, you love it for your patients. You just love where this is leading the medical industry and what it's bringing to you as a physician. And so we had to take that story of great medical technology that is really helping physicians, which of course in turn really helps the patient. And we had to take that and we had to attribute numbers to it. Because you invest using numbers, but you're really investing in the story. You're investing in the story, right? Especially with a company that's baby and is negative earnings and is new. Usually when you pick those companies, you're investing in the story. If we're investing in, I don't know, let's just say if we're investing in Coke, we might not be investing in the story anymore. We're actually investing in the numbers. We're looking at the ridiculous history and whatnot. But with a company like this, you're really investing in the story. So you have to take the story and figure out the numbers. Yeah, and that's what we've tried to do. For me, the analogy I use is almost like bumper bowling. Right? You throw the ball down the lane and these are your bumpers, in a sense. Like running these numbers like your bumpers. So you don't go in the gutter on one way or the other. And so what it did teach me going through these numbers was that the market cap and the share price has swung capriciously over the past 2 years. So it went from a high of around close to $30 a share, which would give it a market capitalization of somewhere around $7 billion. Which is crazy. Bringing in right now. To as low as, I think, $300 million as of recently. It was like $2.50 a share or $3 a share. Yeah, so you can see how the market will swing just, absolutely. And you can also see with those swings, the actual price of a stock has nothing to do with the value of the company. Not at all. Because that $30 and then that $2.50 price, actually we didn't get the low or the high on our valuation. Right. So what it tells me is I should not have been buying when it was $30 a share. Right. And I should have been buying when it was around $2 a share. It was probably a deal. If you believe in the company. If I believe in those numbers. If you think the company is going to be around in 10 years. And again, with a new company, it's very risky. Yeah. The risk is high. Yeah. Well, and one of the things at this point, I think you have to give it, in a sense, is the probability of bankruptcy. Yeah. Because with a non-profitable company, that's always possible. Yeah, could go belly up. Is that percentage 50%? Is it 20%? Is it 10%? What is the probability of a company like BFLY going bankrupt? Right. And so you should probably factor that into your numbers a little bit. So for the BFLY network, in terms of our assumptions are as follows: $12.5 billion total addressable market. At 10% market share, you get a revenue of $1.25 billion in revenue, total revenue. And if you think if we believe on the low end, they'll have 10% net margins, that gives you a net income of $125 million. Okay. And then if you take $125 million net income, multiply that by a PE of 20, you're going to get a $2.5 billion market cap. Okay. And at about 200 million shares outstanding, that translates to a $4.10 per share. $4.10. Now that was our lowest. That's our low end valuation. So you did a 10% net margin. Yep. You did a 10% market share. Yep. You did a 15% discount rate. Yep. Because we always do a 15% discount rate. Yep. So it gives us a nice margin of safety. And you did a 20 PE. 20 PE. So those are the numbers that you used for our lowest valuation. Now, if any of these numbers change on the high or low end, that will change the valuation dramatically, potentially.
And so we'll go to the 15%.
And these are all what we've heard called before windage numbers.
Windage numbers, yes.
They're not static. It's not like for sure they're going to take 10%. It's like
No.
they might take 10%, they might take 8%, they might take 12%, somewhere
right
in and around.
Yeah, if they take more, then these numbers will get better. If they take less,
yes.
these numbers will get worse.
Because we're guessing here.
We're guessing.
We're doing educated guessing based on a story that we love.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
At 15% net margins, at 10% market share, then you get a $1.25 billion in revenue.
Okay.
And if you multiply that by a 15% net margin, you get $187.5 million net income.
Okay.
And if you multiply that by a PE of 20, you get a $3.75 billion market cap.
So quite a bit more.
Quite a bit more. 15% discount rate leads you to $6.15.
Okay, so we would say, and you did one more. This is the least conservative.
This is the least conservative.
We run a very conservative, a medium amount of conservatism.
Yes.
And
So this is kind of my lofty goal here. So if you take a 30% net margin, which is what Intuitive Surgicals is, and you take 10% market share, that gives you a $1.25 billion revenue.
Yeah.
And then you multiply that $1.25 billion in revenue by 30% net margins, which gets you $375 million net income. So $375 million net income. Multiply that by a PE of 20, and that gets you a $7.5 billion market cap. And then at a 15% discount rate over 8 years, you get an intrinsic value of $12.30 per share.
Okay.
That's on the high end.
So that's quite a large range from what is the conservative number is
$4.10.
And the non-conservative number is
$12.30.
Now, we being value investors, okay, well, first of all, we shouldn't even be looking at this company as value investors, but if we wanted to give ourselves more of a margin safety, we wouldn't even entertain that $12.30. Right. We would stick with the more conservative ones, the $6.15 and the $4 and whatever.
Yeah. As being a reasonable range. Now, at that point, you could argue, should we, take even a margin safety there and lock that down? Now, interestingly enough,
maybe you should, because it's such a baby company.
Well, I was going to say, even with our most conservative estimate, it was trading at almost a 50% discount to our most conservative estimate.
Exactly.
So the point being was some of these growth stocks with great stories and very little numbers, they'll swing by wide margins, and you may be able to pick it up at a reasonable valuation.
Right.
And again, at this point, if any of these numbers change, so if they are able to capture more of the addressable market, or the addressable market gets bigger,
which is a very good possibility, which is another reason why we love the story.
Right, which is why we love the story. Or by chance their net margins are not very good, right? So those things would change the valuation one way or another.
And what these numbers do for us is tell us, we don't want to buy this company. At $30, I think that was its high.
At its high,
right? But
it would say stay away.
Right, but if it drops back down to its low at $250, we might want to gobble up quite a few shares. And that's where these numbers are. They're not static numbers, they're not certain numbers, but it does give us, like you say, bumper bowling. It does kind of keep us, heading toward the pins.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't fall into the gutter this way and get caught up in hysteria.
Yes.
And caught up in FOMO and everything else. But it also helps us to stay in our lane and not give into fear when you're seeing it drop to $2. It's like, no, if we believe in the story and we believe in the company, and we believe in the technology and everything that they say they are, then we won't get fear when it drops down to $2.50 or $2.
Exactly. It gives us confidence to at least have some numbers on our side to say, okay, you know what? It's worth more than this.
Exactly. So we ran this one, which is you wouldn't run every company like this.
No.
TAM worked really well for this particular type of company.
Yeah.
But we wanted to show how many steps and how much work it is.
Yeah.
And I mean, you had to parse through quite a few different companies' annual and quarterly reports.
Well, and part of the reason we did it this way as well is because there are other ways to do it. You might want to factor in R&D and SG&A expenses and how those might change over time. And then, of course,
competition. How much competition are they? Is this a really competitive sector?
Well, and then you'll factor in cost of capital and things like that. And that's all well and good. And but the problem was I was going to make more and more and more assumptions. To me, it was becoming more assumption on assumption on assumption. And in this way, I thought I'm making the least number of assumptions.
Exactly.
And so comparing it to loose comparables. And so with taking all those other things in mind, will you be a little bit more accurate? Maybe, maybe not. But to me,
I think you'd be less accurate the more assumptions you're making.
Yeah.
The less accurate you become, because you're also making biased assumptions. No matter how non-biased you're trying to be, you will have some bias in those numbers because you love this company.
Right. Yeah.
You know, you're already biased in choosing this company.
Yeah. So I think at its current price of, call it $5 and change, it's probably somewhere in the middle of where our valuation is, roughly. So is it a buy or a sell right now? Don't ever take their advice. We'll see.
Time will tell. Maybe we'll come back to this in a few years and see if the trajectory of BFLY is on the right path for our valuation.
Well, and that's a good point, is that I think you have to continually revalue your assumptions as time goes on. So revalue the company, do this exercise, quarterly, over and over again, and see, maybe the total addressable market is getting bigger. Maybe they are gobbling market share faster.
Maybe Sonosite wins their lawsuit.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Maybe they exactly. Maybe they lose in court.
A lot can happen to a new company.
Exactly.
So I think that pretty much wraps up our discussion.
Yeah.
Kind of shows the difficulty of valuing a company with negative earnings.
Yeah.
And just how much more work and effort you have to put in to get to the numbers.
Right. And again, for those financial professionals out there who might be watching the video, you may say, well, that's not the way I would do it. And that's fine. We appreciate the feedback. Yeah. But at the same time, again, it gives us a starting point, a launching pad. Exactly. And again, to throw in assumptions after assumptions we didn't think was wise. We wanted to start with the most grassroots numbers that we thought were probably the most reliable and go from there. I think it's Steve Jobs who says there's sophistication in simplicity, and we decided to do it that way. We decided on simplicity rather than sophistication. Maybe that's just their nature. That's maybe true. So that's everything. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe our video, and we'll see you next week.